Bonjour à tous. Eh bien, écoutez, bienvenue. C'est la première masterclass du Whisky Live et je suis ravi de pouvoir vous la présenter. Alors, on va goûter pas mal de choses, comme vous pouvez le remarquer. Vous avez 5 verres devant vous. Vous avez même un petit sixième qui est une petite surprise de Dalmore. Donc, Dalmore qu'on ne présente plus. Ils vont même se présenter eux-mêmes. Alors, vous verrez qu'il y a un deuxième verre qui n'est pas un whisky. Et justement, c'est aussi la chance de ces masterclass, c'est de goûter des choses qui sont un petit peu différentes et qui vont justement permettre, en tout cas, de mieux explorer l'univers Dalmore. Et je vous laisse avec eux tout de suite.
Merci, Gaspar. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see you all here, all happy, smiling in anticipation of some show-stopping whiskies. And I think, Whisky Live Paris, we always enjoy coming to France, especially Whisky Live Paris, because you guys have an unquenchable thirst for Scotch whisky, a country that drinks more Scotch whisky than any other in the world. You guys know how to do it. So, on that note, we felt it would be foolish of us to make you wait for a whisky. So we're actually going to dive right in before we introduce ourselves and talk you through some of the whiskies that we're going to taste over the next 30 minutes. I want you to dive right into sample number 1, which is released no more than 5 minutes ago. In the USA, this is an exclusive that you won't have seen, that you won't have tasted. This is a beautiful 14-year-old single malt from the Dalmore, finished in a Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. So you can enjoy that while we do a couple of introductions and we'll tell you a little bit more about the whiskey. So my name's Steve. I am the global ambassador for the Dalmore, which is very fortunate, seeing as it's one of the most delicious single malts out there, a very generous distillery to work with, both in terms of history and heritage, but also with a really progressive ethos when it comes to whiskey making. And Gregg's such a big part of that. And Gregg, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Stevie. I'm Gregg Glass, so I'm master whiskey maker and blender for the Dalmore, alongside someone called Richard Patterson. Anyone know him? Yeah, he's quite quiet, unassuming as well. But Richard and I, we work on the recipes and the development for the Dalmore itself. So I've been in the industry for around 23 years, the majority of that as a blender and whiskey maker. Yeah.
And Gregg's one of the luckiest whiskey makers I've always felt out there, because he gets to work with such a special distillery with a very progressive attitude to making whiskey, a wonderful spirit for Gregg to nurture over time in casks, and a wonderful philosophy around cask curation. And what did you think of the Dalmore 14? For those of you that have had a little nibble, you've had a nose, you've had a taste, what were your initial thoughts on that single malt? Did you have a taste down here? Yeah? Interesting example of the Dalmore's distinct house style. A lot of that chocolate orange and sweet spice coming through. But from Pedro Jimenez sherry casks, and you can actually jump to sample number 2, which is a sample of Pedro Jimenez sherry. Apologies if you thought that was an 85-year-old Dalmore. I know it's very dark, but that's a Pedro Jimenez wine from Jerez that's been in the cask previously used to mature that 14-year-old single malt whiskey. Maple syrup, lots of dates, prunes, all that delicious stewed fruit coming through, Gregg. I know you were very proud of that one.
Yeah. So as Stevie says, you're some of the first people in the world to have ever tried this. We only just launched this in the USA, and is no plans to release anywhere else other than that. The recipe here, what we looked at was combining American white oak, ex-bourbon, for the classical honeyed, rich, sweet qualities that brings. Around about 40 to 50% ex-bourbon, and the rest has been finished in Pedro Jimenez casks. So this PX is very sweet, a lot of delicious raisins, prunes, and honeyed, rich, sweet honeyed notes. Around about 400 to 430 grams of sugar per litre. So very sweet, very intense that we want. And some of the next whiskies that we're going to try, I'll talk about the balancing of our recipes and our ingredients. So here we're combining the Pedro Jimenez finished element of the 14-year-old with some of the charm that we get from our ex-bourbon casks too.
I think Scotch and sherry have this wonderful intertwined relationship. If you like Scotch, you might by default explore the world of sherry, where you get some delicious fortified wines coming from a wonderful part of the world. And if you're ever lucky enough to travel to the south of Spain and actually visit the Highlands of Scotland, you'll notice that we have nothing in common, really, culturally, with our Spanish friends. Their food is much better. They are far more sophisticated. The sun's shining. However, there's this common goal that we need their quality of wines and the distribution of their casks to Gregg to be able to make whiskey. And the Dalmore is such a good example of a heavily sherry-influenced whiskey. And Pedro Jimenez is at the heart of that for so many of our drams, in particular Apostolese sherry and the rare Methuselah that we use in many of our whiskies. But actually, 100% Pedro Jimenez is something a little bit different, and I really hope you enjoyed that whiskey. But the next one we're going to taste, I tasted this a few months ago for the first time. And my reaction was, I honestly believed that this was one of the best single malts I'd ever worked on. I was terribly excited because the 21-year-old bourbon casks and Methuselah Oloroso sherry, but you start to see a slight shift in character. These kind of rarity of refined characteristics start to shine, Gregg, which, was that deliberate?
Yes, absolutely. So our new 21-year-old, we've actually gone to limited batches and particular vintages because of the rarity of our stocks. And what we wanted to do was to try and elaborate on certain characteristics within Dalmore. What we're looking at here is the antique properties, the older age elements that come through in the Dalmore. So licorice qualities that come through there. This is Methuselah that we have finished, the sherry style. And that's still retaining those berry fruit qualities and depths and complexities. But for our new 21-year-old, these are limited batches, vintage. So this is the 2022 release that we've created here. Stevie, you should try some as well.
Yeah, I think it's quite magnificent. It represents a coming of age for me in terms of the Dalmore's house style. Dalmore is one of those distilleries that improves over time due to the nature of our spirit, which we'll tell you a little bit more about. But at 21-year-old, you see a departure from the juiciness, the lusciousness that you might experience with perhaps the 14-year-old. And as Gregg says, these antique qualities start to shine, not too dissimilar from our cognac friends that talk about rancio. These notes that can only come with time, with patience, and a skilled and passionate whiskey maker. So that was one that we were incredibly proud of.
For sure, that rancio element was something we particularly wanted to build into these releases each year. And we're hand selecting each of these casks.
Number 3, yeah.
That's whiskey number 3. So these elements like nuttiness that you get through, so some of those roasted hazelnuts and walnut notes come through because of that age. Some people will pick up a little bit, almost an umami quality, which is more on the palate, umami, but you should find that classical age that comes through. I'll talk a little bit about our warehouses. And this is one of the factors, because of our warehousing, that helps to promote these antique qualities and flavors.
Dalmore is particularly unmistakable when it comes to the world of single malt, so recognizable in terms of spirit style, but actually in terms of aesthetics and personality. You can't mistake a bottle of Dalmore. That, you know, the wide hips on the bottle, designed to mirror the shape of the stills, and the prominent stag that comes through as well. And the stag tells us of people and place. And the story of the Dalmore, we can narrow down to our unique 4 principles that came about towards the late 19th century that shaped the Dalmore as we know it today. Now, if you are lucky enough to go to Edinburgh, you have to go to Edinburgh. And in between jumping in and out of whisky bars, if you fancy a little bit of culture, you can visit the National Gallery of Scotland at the bottom of the castle, and you can walk in. And the first painting you'll see on your right-hand side is The Fury of the Stag, painted by Benjamin West in 1686. Now, this depicts a scene from 1263 where the protagonist is King Alexander III. And King Alexander III, you will know, we created a whisky in homage of this noble king not so long ago, a 6-cask finished whisky, which is quite remarkable. But here, this shows King Alexander III being saved by the chief of the clan Mackenzie from a charging stag. And in gratitude, the king granted the Mackenzies a lot of land and favour around Scotland. He also granted them use of the 12-point stag as their clan crest. Now, in 1867, 2 Mackenzie brothers came to the Dalmore distillery with ideas around distillation, with ideas around maturation in the 1860s, when this was virtually unheard of in the world of single malts. Also, marketing. They put their clan crest on the bottle to tell the story of, the people they were and where they are, which is in the North Highlands. And over time, the stag has become shinier, slicker, and it radiates back at you from every single bottle of Dalmore. And it speaks of the Mackenzies, the people that were there, which we're very proud of. What the Mackenzies also did was they fiddled around with the distillation regime. And I think on behalf of Gregg and myself, you are all welcome to come to the distillery at any time, and we'll show you around what is a truly magnificent place to drink single malt whisky, Gregg. I'm sure you would agree. Yeah. The North Highlands of Scotland. Beautiful place, but it's not just a nice romantic place to enjoy a whisky. You'll see some fascinating process quirks, and particularly in our still house, where you have a unique composition of stills that creates a spirit heavy, chunky, full-bodied, robust, suited to long maturation. And this is due to flat-top wash stills and spirit stills with a water jacket on the outside. So they're quite cool. If you're into visiting distilleries, these little features and quirks are always quite nice to see. But like I say, Gregg's a very lucky whiskey maker to be able to nurture the spirit. And it's actually on your table if you want to nose it. It's at the far end of all your rows. There is a sample of new make spirit. You probably won't have seen. No, that one. There's just one glass for each table, so you can pass it down and have a nose. But it's at about 69%, so it's quite powerful. But by all means, have a little nose and taste. But this gives Gregg the opportunity to curate some of the world's most exquisite casks to mature our whisky.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you should find here with our new make on the nose is beautiful, weighty cereal notes, creaminess, and even some fruit structure. Now, the house style, the DNA of the Dalmore, are key characters like citrus, orange, chocolate notes that come through, and particularly with our enhancement, our cask and maturation policy is richness through the types of casks that we use. But what you should find on the nose of our new make is that weight and what I call an old school Highland style. Because we've developed this process of distillation over many years, over 180 years at the Dalmore, we've wanted to keep true to that traditional style. Now that helps us in the next stage, after the distillation through to the maturation. We start our maturation typically in American white oak, first fill ex-bourbon, or it can be refill if we choose so. And that American white oak start in life softens and adds an element to the citrus notes, particularly with the Dalmore. And then we look at enhancing the spirit. Now, the previous slide, we have actually some documentation that goes back to the early days of the Dalmore to show this cask enhancement program. So this is not something that's brand new. This is something that we've actually developed since particularly the Mackenzie era at the distillery. So this is staying true to our tradition, but at the same time, we can innovate we can try out new things, new types and styles of wines throughout our process. But then the next slide, you'll see, again, as I mentioned there, that initial maturation we're doing in American white oak, and then we look to root that whiskey into different styles of casks. So we're very famous for our partnership with González Bias in particular, for example, our Pedro Jimenez sourcing there. That's a partnership that we've had for well over 100 years documented within the distillery. Now, we continue that relationship because of the qualities and the uniqueness of what those casks bring to our naturally beautiful spirit to start off with as well.
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate at the decisions of our forefathers, the Mackenzies, that recognised that we needed time in cask. In an era when a lot of single malt was sold off the still, they started to rest their whiskies for 3 years, for 5 years, for 12 years. And actually, this document here, and you won't be able to read this, but this is a ledger from the Mackenzies. And what was great about Andrew and Charles Mackenzie was they wrote everything down. They were very accomplished farmers, and we've got a great insight into what they were doing on the Dalmore farm in the 1860s. But they were also meticulous in their record keeping when it came to whiskey production. And this document here shows that they bottled a 23-year-old whiskey in 1891, which by today's standards is still old. People thought these guys were crazy, but they persisted. They recognized the whiskey needed time in cask, and that's why we're lucky to have some old and rare stocks that, of course, can command astronomical prices. And here's a little bit about our partnership with González Bias. And we're very fortunate to have exclusive access to Apóstoles, and in particular, Methuselah sherry casks. And if you go down to Jerez, go and visit our friends at González Bias, and they'll treat you to some wonderful sherries that beautifully complement our house style. Now, we've always had a fierce loyalty to the sherry casks of Jerez, but when Richard Patterson arrived at the distillery in 1970, he extended this whiskey-making idea into the world of port, into the world of Madeira, Marsala, and actually, this next whiskey, which is a money-can't-buy whiskey, this is so rare, the only place it exists is in your glasses. This is something that Gregg selected. It's a beautiful 1990s assemblage. Gregg, I'll let you chat them through.
Yeah, sure. So I thought what would be quite interesting, seeing as you've taken the time to come and see us, was to give you the opportunity to try something that's never going to be available. So this is something that I've selected from our warehousing and actually have created this assemblage, this combination of two different styles. Now, for me, I grew up opposite the distillery, so it's my local distillery from birth. So during the 80s, 90s, the Dalmore distillery was always iconic within the local environment and community. And what I thought would be quite interesting was share some whiskies from that sort of period. And to bring it back to France, Chateau Montredon are a fantastic partner and producer. We've used some of their casks for our Decades project in the past. And also a newer partnership that we've started with an Amarone producer in Italy. Thought it'd be quite interesting to look at a combination of different wine styles within there. But as Stevie says, we're going back to our history, where we have that real connection with the sherry houses. And really 20, coming on 30 years ago, Richard had nurtured relationships with the Symington family, Graham's Port in particular, but also looking to expand out to different styles. So this whiskey number 4, it would be very interesting to see what you think about this one. So naturally, this has gone down to a lower ABV. 1996 is the youngest component that I've used here. Now, with the 21-year-old, you may have noticed that antique property, but also quite what we would call a charming style. quite fresh, bright, lots of top notes, lots of layers of characteristics. And that's what we're trying to do with all of our whiskey making at the Dalmore. We produce this old school Highland style. It's got a medium to heavy body. We can therefore pair medium to heavy body styles of wines, but we can also use lighter influences to create these elegant top notes to the recipes too. Anything in particular that you pick out here? So that's Châteauneuf de Pape that's been used in terms of the partnership we have with the French winery. So perhaps some of those berries. Don't know, Steve, do you pick out anything in particular?
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously we talk a lot about the nose and the palate and the finish of a whiskey. I think here, in terms of body and structure, that's such a beautiful use of Châteauneuf de Pape casks and your Amarone casks as well. Like you said, some of those red fruits are slightly more prominent. Perhaps a little bit of rose petal, Turkish delight territory, but those antique, refined characteristics that are far removed from, say, a younger Dalmore that's juicier, gives you an idea and an indication as to how our spirit can develop over time. We're lucky to have a distillery that I think we think it peaks late. You know, our whiskey just improves and improves with time. And this is a lovely little window into what's possible up at the Dunwich warehouses at the Dalmore.
And I think that dynamic of age is all about that beautiful spirit that's got the weight and interesting characters to start off with to allow us that long maturation, but also us carefully managing that through the years and the decades as well. But certainly that Turkish delight note, the rose petals, on the palate, you should find it's beautiful and rich, but soft at the same time for that alcohol level.
I hope you enjoyed that one. That was something quite special, and you know, Gregg gets to play with some truly magnificent whiskies. And I mentioned earlier about the distinction of the character of our whiskies. Dalmore's so unmistakable in terms of personality and style. And like we say, this comes from the decision of the Mackenzies and the whiskey makers that then followed. The distillery was in the hands of the Mackenzies through 3 generations of whiskey makers, and each generation had this obsession with perfection, constantly building on the learnings of their predecessors. And that's where the masterpiece in the making, the significance of our attitude to whiskey making comes in, because, like I say, Richard extended our loyalty to sherry cask into port, wine, Madeira, and so forth. And now we have Gregg very much taking on responsibility of developing that further. And actually, Gregg, I'm excited to see what comes in years to come with very much your attention to oak type, wood treatment, the assembly of a cask. And, you know, next week we've got something super exciting coming out that is a great representation of Gregg's whiskey-making philosophy. Shall we try the last whiskey? Have we got a couple of minutes left? 6 minutes left. 6 minutes is perfect to try something quite special. Again, something that Gregg has hand-selected for you all today, which is whiskey number 5.
Yeah, absolutely. Stevie, would you mind popping
Of course.
back just a couple? This actually relates quite well to these 2 whiskies, which are, again, one-offs just for the show here. For you guys to try. We'll not be able to replicate these. These are living casks. But this is an example of one of our warehouses that we have at the Dalmore. So we have these beautiful dunnage warehousing here. This is warehouse number 2. It's one of our favourites. Warehouse 2, 3, and 4 are particular favourites of Richard and I's. But what you can see here is on warehouse 2, 2 different floors. Here are the sherry butts. They're large, old school, 600-litre sherry butts that come from González Bias. And that's not standard in the whiskey industry, but we're continuing that tradition. And that's why they're single level high. On our earthen floors, these are railway sleepers from the railway that used to go next to the distillery itself. And on our second floor, you can see some of our bourbon casks, and you get a different dynamic even in Scotland with that that different level as well. Just these subtle things that happen over 10, 20, 30 years that make a big difference. So from the bourbon cask, some of these casks will get re-racked into these beautiful bourbon casks. And then from here, whiskey number 6 that we have, again, is one that's just for you.
So this is a 39-year-old 1982 cask that's been finished in a combination of 2 different wines. So we have Pedro Jimenez, and if you haven't finished your Pedro Jimenez sample, you can go back in and have a nose and see where some of these flavors come from. But we've also got a 30-year-old tawny port pipe from Graham's Port Lodge down in the Douro. And you can get yourself down to the Douro, try some of these wines, and you can visit Graham's, who probably make one of the most robust, expressive ports out there. So we have a partnership with Graham's due to the style of wines they make, but also because Graham's trace their roots back to Scotland, to Glasgow, to 1820. So there's a nice little alignment there as well.
So for me, particularly on the nose, this reminds me of going into Warehouse 2, which is right next to the Cromarty First. So if you nose this, you get that almost a sweet licorice, sweet rancio sort of quality, but mustiness to it. And there's lovely, almost like raspberries and black currants that are coming through within here. But just so elegant, rich, balanced. So even at this age, close to 40 years, you can still have these nuances of top notes and aftertaste that come through. So again, this is purely natural that's come through, so it's naturally come down to this lower alcohol rate of 42%.
Isn't it funny, the older you get, it's very difficult to find a whiskey that's older than you. And this one's actually a little bit older than me, so Greg, thank you for pulling that one out. That's something that's quite delicious.
Yeah, those rich nuttiness and sugared almonds that come through. This is real, like, classical Dalmore for me, but this is like being at our distillery in our warehousing with us.
Well, you're all going to try some wonderful whiskies, whether it's today, tomorrow, here at Whisky Live Paris, and hopefully some of the whiskies that we've presented you live long in the memory. Certainly that 39-year-old to finish is just one of those little whiskey moments that you'll hopefully remember for a long time. Thank you for coming up here to support the Dalmore and listen to us talk about our whiskies. And hopefully we'll see you downstairs, no doubt, to share a couple of drams over the next couple of days.
Yep. Slàinte mhath, everyone. Slàinte. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.